Welcome, everybody. My name is Julie McKinney, and I'm with the IHA's Health Literacy Solutions Center. And our webinar today is about creating actionable and engaging patient information. Just a few quick housekeeping things before we get started. Hopefully you all have audio. You will all be muted during the webinar. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button on the bottom right of your screen. If you're on a desktop, I think it's different on an iPad. If you have comments or want to say stuff, just feel free to use the chat box. But if you have questions for the speakers, it's helpful if you can put them in the Q&A button instead. That helps us to keep track of them. They will have questions at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can email the emails on your screen, support@healthliteracysolutions.org, and someone will help you right away. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the Health Literacy Solutions Center on our webinar page, and the PowerPoint will also be available. So just so you know that the recording and the PowerPoint will all be there for you. If you requested CEUs, you will get an email after the webinar with a link to a brief online evaluation. Once you submit the evaluation, we will send you your certificate. So that's how that works. I'm going to introduce our speakers now. Gaius Augustus is a trained artist and scientist. Started their career as a video editor, working with animators and filmmakers to perfect the timing of their projects. They later returned to university for science, earning a BSc in Integrative Studies in 2014 and their PhD in Cancer Biology in 2019. Now they put their interdisciplinary expertise together to create engaging visual stories. And there's Gaius's Twitter handle, and you'll get these slides. And then we have Jerry Lynn Baumblot. Jerry's worked at the intersection of health literacy, interactive multimedia, shared decision-making, patient, family, and clinician experience, and partnered in research for over 20 years. She's done a whole bunch of things. She's created and tested hundreds of resources for health tech companies and organizations like ARC. She's on the editorial leadership board for the Journal of Patient Experience, PCORI's Patient Engagement Advisory Panel, and is the Chief Engagement Officer for Docula, a social good free patient education platform. So welcome to Jerry. And finally, we have Paige Giroud, who is a biomedical scientist turned science communication scholar. She got her PhD in science communication, studying how scientists use new media to reach broader audiences. After an Instagram research project called #ScientistsWhoSelfie, she became interested in the intersection of SciComm, visuals, and trust. That interest ultimately led her to co-found Lifeology with Dorian Alagara. So welcome to Jerry, Gaius and Paige, and I will let you guys take it away. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Julie. So I'm just going to quickly walk through some of the challenges here, which I think this audience is fairly familiar with. Why is it so hard to educate and engage people? And beyond being just scared and intimidated and the issues we know with health literacy, people on top of it also aren't feeling well. There's these challenges with working memory where we know whatever we say to them in the moment, they're often only going to remember a small fraction of that by the time they even walk out the door. And they're disoriented. They're in hospital and care settings. They often don't know the why or the how of things, which we'll talk about. And then on top of that, we often don't know what's important to them. What are their goals and preferences? Like, yes, people don't want to be in pain or feel bad, but beyond that, they have things they want to do with their lives. And then, of course, increasingly, there's this focus and understanding of how the social determinants of health affect their ability to engage as well. So I really love Jessie Grumman's patient engagement framework, and you'll see this little short bit.ly link under her name. And I would encourage you to check out that article. It's a great short piece that walks through this framework. Jessie actually passed away a few years ago. She was kind enough to actually blog for me while she was terminally ill, which I didn't even know at the time. So she was really, really dedicated to this work. And she said that what people really need to be able to engage is to know that their participation is important, possible, and safe. And honestly, if you just asked yourself those questions when you're creating something, I think that goes a long way to figuring out if what you've created is going to help meet people where they are. But let's dive into what that means. So when you think about something like heart failure, people need to weigh themselves every day, which is not something anybody wants to do. But people often don't even understand why they're being asked to do this. Like they think, what, I'm gaining weight, I don't want to think about that. But they don't understand often that they're gaining water weight, and that even a small weight gain of this fluid means that their heart is having a harder time, and it's an early warning sign. So helping people understand just why that's important is so critical, because this is something nobody wants to do every day, is step on a scale. And then, is it possible for them to do this? Do they even have a scale at home? Is it sensitive enough to pick up small weight gain? And then safety, is it even safe for them to stand on this scale and look down and try and read it? Or are they a fall risk? Is it unstable? Do they have a safe place to put it? So these things sound simple, but if we're not looking into these and helping people think about them, they're going to get home and realize that they can't even do something, even if they understand why they're supposed to do it. And that why is so crucial. So if you think again about something like heart failure, where people need to take water pills, well, that often makes you have to go to the bathroom more. So if people don't understand why it's so important for them to both track their fluids and take these water pills so that it's not putting extra burden on their heart, they're not going to do that because they don't want to have to constantly get up and go to the bathroom. Or even things like reducing sodium. Why is that important? And then again, is it possible? So thinking again about something like sodium, we can tell people, hey, this is important and here's why. But they often think that just means taking the salt shaker off the table. So explaining to people that, there's huge amounts of salt in like canned soup or in diet soda or in some of these places where there's hidden salt is usually more important in terms of helping them how, but can they take that medication? Can they inject insulin? And do they have the ability to like read the instructions for literacy or vision, or can they afford the medication? Or even I watched my mom the other day struggle to open a package that something was in and just almost completely give up. So then again, safe. So does a medication have side effects that they've seen their friends have, so they're scared to take it? Or there's even been evidence that when people report side effects they're experiencing to their care team, that it's often just kind of dismissed as like, yeah, but you need to just keep taking that. But we really need to address concerns people have, or they don't feel safe doing things. Or again, is it safe for them to take as many water pills as they're taking if they're a fall risk and it means they constantly have to get up and go to the bathroom? So those are just an example of how I try and think through this important, possible, and safe so that people can engage in their care. And that's what I'm usually looking for, needs to be in the resources that I'm developing. And of course, in addition to that, this is a health literacy solutions center. So we know that people need resources that are easy to understand and act on, and that really help them with that sense making, help them make sense of their situation or instructions, but are also not just like a laundry list or dry instructions, but are empathetic to who they are and what they're going through. So that's a much more kind of rounded idea of what we need. And we don't want to make things too long, but we also want people to like understand that we get what they're going through, because people are really more likely to trust resources that understand their lived experiences and concerns. And I think that sounds minor, but it's so important. I remember developing resources on hip pain and just taking a 30 or 60 seconds at the beginning of a video to say, hey, I know that this causes problems with sleeping. And so then you don't even get good sleep, and it's not even always about pain. And then you feel like you can't, go on that walk with your grandkids or whatever. Like, you just looked around the room and you saw people nodding. And then you see, oh, this resource understands what this is like for me and why this is so important to me. Then they're much more likely to trust the next information that's coming. They really need things that help them make sense of their situation or any instructions. A lot of times people, even if the instructions are good, if they don't make sense to them, they'll kind of make up their own logic for it. And again, that warmth and competence is so important. And in fact, I want Gaius and Paige to jump in here, because we talk about this a lot, trust, and like how you create resources that people can trust. Like, yes, it's good if they're coming from their clinician who's actually saying, this is what you should look at and read, but also, we know about these two universal dimensions of trust, which is warmth. Does this person or this resource demonstrate that they have my best interest at heart? And is it competent? Is it reliable? And so, guys, Paige, I know you guys have some experience with this too. And like, why is this so important? And how do you try and do this in the work of the resources you create?
I have a short example. When I was working for the at the University of Arizona Cancer Center, we were doing some science communication around health disparities. And one doctor actually came to us and said that they were working with the Native community on diabetes care. And they went out there to meet with the tribe, and they told them, you need to go exercise, you need to eat better. And he noticed there were confused faces, and he asked, and one of them said, we work out in the field every day. Like, we're out, we're doing stuff, we're working hard. And he suddenly realized that he had just made assumptions, a lot of assumptions about that community. And it really, when he was telling that story, really at home, and he said this, you have to go to where people are. So you can't just create something and avoid. You have to ask people and involve them very early in the process. And I thought it was a good example.
Yeah, definitely. Paige, you want to add anything? I know this is a big point that we were kind of talking about together earlier.
Yeah, I think, this warmth, versus competence it really is, a huge deal. And it even small things can help to communicate that warmth, with Lifeology, with a lot of stuff we try to do, it's transparency, it's talking about our own experiences or mistakes, or even as science and health experts, kind of like creating a personal relationship with whoever we're talking to or the target audience, like before we jump into the facts or explaining things. And so I think establishing that really just relationship building from the start is so important. And I do a lot of communications, online, where you're not necessarily talking to people, but you can start that relationship building in stuff that you're writing without directly talking to people, by, talking about your own experiences, how your mind was changed. For example, if you're talking to someone about changing, trying to change their mind, revealing things about yourself in order to help them relate to you, I think could be really important.
Yeah, and I think sometimes just normalizing certain things too, like talking about, hey, if you're living with diabetes or whatever it is, this can be kind of overwhelming. And, you don't want to have to think about it every day. Even just getting into that common mindset so that people feel, oh, that's not just me. I know when we were working on a program for thinking about quitting smoking, one of the things that we said was that it takes most people about 7 quit attempts. And at first we were like, oh, don't tell people that. That's depressing and overwhelming. And people loved it because they were like, oh, that's not just me. Everybody struggles with this. And we said, yeah, think of it this way. If you've made 3 previous quit attempts, you're like halfway through, and maybe you'll quit with the next one. But if you don't, don't beat yourself up. So getting into that, knowing that that's normal and reflecting those things back to people, I think means a lot to them in terms of them having faith that they can do something, but also feeling like, oh, this resource understands what it's like. And so I think that really gets into what we all know is so important, is really this co-designing and involving patients and families and clinicians, frankly, in both researching and then testing the resources that we build. And I know there's a lot of talk about this, and then people often fall back on things like readability formulas, which are helpful when you're first drafting something, but definitely don't tell you whether or not something really is resonating with people or is meaningful to people. And so some of the things we do are, you know, those initial interviews or surveys, and I've even had good, you know, success sometimes just going on social media and asking people to take a survey, because people are also happy to help other people. Like, we like to pay them when we can and incentivize them. Or having people do a Think Aloud, where anybody who like then signs up for a survey say, hey, are you just willing to like walk me through what you do in the morning when you're, you know, waking up and you first have those asthma attack or whatever it might be. And then again, there's things like observation and contextual inquiry, which are a little bit harder to do, but you know, even just writing a program about the ER, we went and hung out in the ER for half a day, and it's amazing what you learn just from sitting there and watching people and sometimes talking to a few people. But Paige, guys, are there any other types of things that you guys have found to be like really helpful? I know when I'm doing videos or interactive multimedia for the testing phase, we often do focus groups, because part of what you get to do then is you get to watch them as a group, watch the video and see like, are they nodding and all like, or are they all like laughing with each other, or are they kind of making fun of it a little bit, or like rolling their eyes? And you really, you know, those are things you can then follow up with afterwards. That's really candid, like in the moment responses that you can't get otherwise.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I mean, one thing that I often find, you know, us doing and lifology is just like reaching out at the very beginning before we even create content and talking to people, you know, especially if we're trying to create content for a specific audience where we don't have experience of their lived experience, just reaching out and talking to them and being very open-ended and hearing their stories. I mean, it's so valuable to, you know, before we even start thinking about putting content down on paper.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that if you are using services or you are creating any visual media, the same as you want to bring in input early, you want to bring in input from a creative person early, because they probably have experience creating, you know, engaging visuals. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And one of the things that I've really tried to do locally is develop partnerships. It's obviously harder with COVID, but during normal times, I often just go on site to places here in Chicago, like the Greater Westtown Project has been amazing. There's just some literacy programs that have been great. And they're thrilled to have their, you know, the people who come into their programs participate in helping to review these resources. And in fact, I often even write up a little card and say, you can put this on your resume that you were a reviewer for this project. And so I think there's even ways beyond financial that are super meaningful to people for them to be involved in this type of thing. And they love knowing that this is going to help other people. And so, you know, we really talk about getting that lived experience, because that's going to create that trust and agency. And Paige, I know you had a few examples of feedback. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I get some of that feedback and insights through Think Aloud, but what types of things have you gotten as you've worked on things with lifology?
Yeah, so and if you aren't familiar with lifology, I posted a link to actually the little, we call them flashcard courses that we created like on health literacy that this presentation is based on. So you could go to see an example, but we create basically little visual stories that are very mobile friendly for people to engage with, that we've created for different purposes, including kind of clinical trial participant education. And a lot of times, one thing that I think is a real concern is that a lot of times when we are creating courses for clients, for example, they have often left pretty limited time to get this audience feedback. So it sounds amazing to, and it's so important to get audience feedback. But when you have like 2 weeks to create content like we did in some of these cases, that can just be really difficult, but I think I'm a big proponent of like something is better than nothing in these cases. So here's some courses that we've created where we did reach out, and we might not have done, whole, focus groups that lasted a long time, but we made sure that we got early feedback before we even started writing the stories for these courses. So one was based on a story for kids trying to communicate to them about COVID. So, I mean, we just went to like, employees within our organization who had kids and be like, go to your kids and ask them like, what questions do they have about COVID without any prompts? Like, just what are they interested in right now? And just, working with kids that we know, we got a lot of input that before we even wrote the story, and then we brought it back to them to show it to them. Similar with it, we had to write a course on what are clinical trials for Eli Lilly that was targeted, that, had a desired audience of Native Americans. And this was, tough as someone who doesn't have like inlets to this organization, to these populations. I really just had to kind of cold call, reach out to people. And so I wasn't able to get kind of audience reviewers, but I was able to reach out to community leaders in these spaces and have them talk to them at first about some things that were going on, what these Native American communities, or like what barriers there might be to clinical trials, or what their, general, what some concerns or some, opinions might be about participating. And so that we had several discussions that led to creating these materials. And so, reach out, if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to answer, but sometimes I'm just using my personal connections and also online mediums to kind of putting out a call on Twitter to say, like, if you know anyone who is a Native American artist, I'm looking for someone, and just trying to reach out to online forums to get help is one way that I was able to kind of quickly find individuals that I could incorporate it into the creation process when there was a very like strict timeline on creating these materials.
Yeah, I think that something is better than nothing is absolutely true. And I've even done things like gone to the senior center where my mom lives to find people to review things. And it's been incredibly helpful. The one that I want to spotlight is the Think Aloud method, because it really takes no resources other than time and finding people. And it's as simple as, especially with written materials or print materials or a first draft of even a script or something like that, having a participant say what they think as they read it out loud, or in the research phase as they're doing tasks and just telling you about their day-to-day experience with a medication or a device or whatever it might be. And then the hardest thing is to really just shut up, listen, and ask neutral questions. But it really is one of the most effective ways to get those higher level thinking processes and get them in the moment. Because when you give people time to report back to you later, they tend to try and make things, they want to make themselves look good. There's some impression management that can go on there. So in the moment, you can actually see how people are responding to things. And it's really just letting them read through it out loud. And then as you go asking questions like, well, what do you think of the art? Or tell me what you're looking at here. What are you seeing? Or if somebody rereads something a couple times or rolls their eyes or just kind of sighs, that's one I see a lot, is people just kind of being like, and just kind of be like, you reread that or you sighed, tell me about that. And then another one I often ask is just what's missing, and did this answer your questions, or are there any key questions in here that aren't in there? And I've gotten huge things like, oh, this doesn't cover post-op depression, which is a huge deal in many cases. And we were like, wow, it doesn't, because that was not on the doctor's minds when we started getting the scoping for this. And there's a lot of benefits to it. You get these unexpected insights. It goes beyond people on the team, no matter how well informed they are, saying, well, I think we should include this, or I think we should say something this way. You really see and hear what's problematic or working well, and it gets at that cognitive processing, and you don't need any special equipment. And the other nice thing is they even find that it's pretty optimal. If you just talk to 4 or 5 people, you start to hear the same things and you start to say, oh, that's not just this one outlier person. So it's not like you have to do this with huge groups of people. And just to give you an example of some of the types of insights we've seen when I've done this, is that you really know when you're giving people what they need in terms of sense making. So for example, with something like spine surgery or something, we tell people, oh, it's really important not to smoke in the weeks before surgery because smoking can cause problems with healing. And you think, ta-da, I've given them enough information. And what you learn is, no, that really wasn't quite enough information, because people just think their doctors don't want them to smoke. But if you start to explain, well, your bones actually need blood to heal, and smoking affects blood flow, so that's why your doctor wants you to do that, that can kind of help it click for them. But often we think we've given people logic when we haven't quite given them what they really need. This is also true in terms of, I think there needs to be a level of candor. I sometimes say compassionate candor, to help people really understand what's going on. People don't like to hear bad news, but in the case of something like a hip fracture, especially in somebody who's elderly, that's often a very serious situation, and they don't realize it. They think, first of all, there's causality issues. They think, oh, I fell and I broke my hip. And what often happens if somebody's truly frail is one of the largest bones in their body breaks and then they fall. And explaining that to people, and that's why this is so serious, that it's actually a sign that they've become very frail, is important for them if you want them to really engage in physical therapy, or if you want them to engage in advanced care planning, which can be very important at that point in time. So people often need to hear these things a few times for it to sink in. When I was testing resources on this, I had a couple family members tell me, oh no, that's not true. People don't often die within a couple years of a hip fracture. And then they'd be like, although my mom did pass away about a year later. And then they'd kind of sit there and think about it and be like, oh, I didn't want to hear that even after the fact, but I think that is true. Another really interesting one, the last example I'll give, is finding about like past experience and resistance. So with enhanced recovery after surgery, we're now telling people, hey, unless you're diabetic, your doctor may actually want you to drink something sweet 2 to 4 hours before surgery, because it helps your body recover. And I had people just tell me to my face, I'm not doing that, or I'm not having my loved one doing that. They've had multiple surgeries, and we've been told for decades, like, do not eat or drink anything after midnight. So this was the type of thing where we really need to put in some extended information about why this is safe and why this helps the body recover without getting too long. And then the other big part of this was, we also told the care teams, like, you are really going to have to reinforce this with people, because they do not think this is safe. They've been told too many times not to do this, and now we're like flipping this on its head, and they're scared. They're not just going to blindly follow instructions. So I'm going to stop there, because now we're going to move into Gaius, talking more about visuals. But just briefly, Julie, were there any key questions or clarifications that anybody put in?
Yeah, we have a few questions. I'm gonna put forward 2 of them now, and the rest we can save till the end, because these ones relate to the to the process of checking to see what people think. One is, are there any tips to the Think Aloud method if it's done on a virtual platform?
That's a good question. I've only done it a couple of times on a virtual platform. I think one of the things would be that I found helpful is to just screen share, because you want to make sure that you're looking at the same thing together at the same time, whether it's a video or print material. And beyond that, I actually think it's worked just as well for me because people, the main thing has been to find like a private room. So even when I go on site, these different places, I'm like, well, is there an office I can use or where can we sit? Because I want people to feel like it's totally safe and confidential for them to tell me, because people tell you a lot of stories. So I actually feel like the virtual setting has been pretty good. Paige, guys, have either of you had opportunity to do any virtual testing?
Yeah, we actually did some like user Bob stuff, which is like basically they have their own platform where we put some lifeology courses and people were supposed to like read through it while sharing their screen. And it was extremely helpful just because like you were seeing their facial expression as they were reading through, like in, live. So I thought that worked really well, actually, and gave us a lot of insight.
Yeah, so as long as you both have your cameras on and you can screen share, my experience has been that it's worked pretty well. I think the main challenge, frankly, would be with certain groups, maybe older people, less tech savvy people, if they just have trouble getting on the platform. I think that's been my biggest barrier is, can somebody help them just get on the platform if they need it? And I do know, by the way, that even FaceTime now you can use with people who aren't on Apple. So even as like a free thing where you don't want someone to have to download Zoom, or if they're not familiar with it, there's lots of, I'm just saying increasingly, I think even LinkedIn now might be offering some, there's just so many options now to try and make it easier for people to get on any kind of video interaction.
Thanks, guys. Just one more question, then we will get to the others at the end. Is how do you test these messages with people with disabilities or those who are in the throes of an illness and need a particular message? I know disabilities is a very broad category, so, but to the extent that you can answer that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been in cases even where somebody was a beginning enough reader, but really wanted to go through the process where I almost read it to them, which is fine. I think you can do that if they really just can't read for vision issues or for literacy issues. And I just said, I would just stop at the end of each paragraph, or I just watch their face and be like, what do you think of that? Tell me in your own words. Did that make sense? So I think there are ways that you can do that. I'm trying to think for other disability issues.
I
Usually,
want to mention, and I'm going to get to this in my slides, so I won't go too far, but that also providing resources in different modes. So like this idea of multimodal communication, people do better with video, and some people do better with print materials, and just being able to communicate on multiple levels with multiple platforms can really help with a lot of that type of stuff, because maybe one doesn't work well for them, but another is more accessible.
yeah, and I think you were also asking, Julie, about people who are currently ill or having like
Yeah, in the throes of an illness.
yeah, so I mean, usually what we try to do is recruit people somewhat on both sides of the experience. People who have maybe lived with a condition for a long time or have had like a surgery or a procedure within the last like year or two. And then people who are maybe newly diagnosed or coming up on a procedure or are likely to need it. And that's trying to get people to say, what do you wish you'd known now that you've been through this process versus what are you scared of? You know, what are your concerns? And I don't know. I mean, we've even had people who've had pretty serious back and hip pain and things like that. And frankly, in some ways, doing it virtually might even allow for more people who don't have to travel and deal with those challenges of mobility or whatever issues they might have, to do some of this virtually as well. Might in some ways even make it easier.
Thank you guys so much. We'll let you guys keep going with the presentation, then we'll get to some others at the end.
All right, thank you. So again, we're going to shift gears, talking about engaging and inclusive visuals. And first, I just want to talk about what we're built to do evolutionarily. And we're really built to take in communication from all over the place that's visual, audio, like all sorts of our senses, and really synthesize that information to give us a whole picture about what's going on. And one of the things that we'll talk about in a moment is related to faces, how we can see faces everywhere, but also the idea of not just using visuals, but using visuals with other types of things, with sound, or with being able to like tactile touch something. And all of these things together come back to really the first form of communication that existed between people, and that's storytelling, where we're built to understand stories, and so stories can be really powerful. And understanding all of this about our history and how we're built can tell us how we can use visuals. For example, we can use visuals again to use all that sensory information to help people understand complex topics or give them instructions. We can also use this to improve accessibility so that we can reach more people. And to make the people that we do reach, we want to make sure that they retain that information, and visuals can help with that as well. Next. So here's an example. This would be a goal: infographics improve readability. And these are two visuals that we could potentially use. And I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of using faces and also when you might not. So on the left, we have an infographic by itself. And on the right, we have that same infographic, but we have pictures of people and arrows pointing to that infographic. And what I would say is the same sentence, infographics improve readability, that you can have two purposes. One is focusing heavily on infographics, like why are infographics great, right? And in that case, I would use just an infographic. But if my goal was to talk about readability and how we can improve readability to patients or something like that, really having those faces in there brings that message home. And so having some intentional thoughts about how to build whatever visuals you are building really can make a huge difference. Next. So I'm a storyteller at heart. Most of us are storytellers. We tell stories all the time, and we can utilize that in our communication. So this is an example. This was a 30-card course that I did for Lifeology, and I've just taken out 4 that I think tell the story pretty well. So I'm going to walk you through them real quick. So the top left is our first card, and this is a doctor and the patient looking at a group of cells. And there's this blue squiggly thing going around, and that's the representation of cancer. On the next visual, we have the doctor, and he is talking to the patient who we can't see in this particular slide, and she's talking about a certain set of cells that are like superheroes. In the third panel, we have the patient laying down, they're about to get treatment, and we can see a word bubble next to that tube of treatment that has these, superhero cells in them. And then in the last panel, we have our doctor and patient again, holding a clipboard, smiling, which may indicate that the results look good. And this is an example of how a story can help you learn information. You learn about these superhero cells, you learn how they're addressing this cancer. And again, this is just 4 images. We did a set of 30. And so this storytelling method can really take a topic that's very complex, like cancer and immunotherapy, and allow it to be more accessible to people who probably aren't going to understand or might even be like wary of these big words that they don't know what they mean. Next. So I also want to talk a little bit more about that multimodal communication, because I think that that's really important. So it's great to have images. Most of what I do is images, but I also think that having other forms of communication alongside that is incredibly beneficial. So on the right, you see that there's just an animated GIF, and it's pretty much talking about homeostasis, that having a temperature too high can be bad, having a temperature too low can be bad. And you can actually use the same visual for a lot of different things. And depending on what the 2 extremes are, you can talk about how being in the middle, being balanced is important. And on the left is a animation that I created. And this is really an animation. It has text to help people read. It has audio to help people get more engaged in the music, which I'm not playing because I'm talking, I guess. It also has these visuals and movements so people can understand how these cells are invading and how things are changing in the body. Next. So now I'm going to shift from engaging visuals to talking about creating inclusive visuals. And one of the things that I think is really important is contrast. And I bring this up because oftentimes if a visual doesn't have enough contrast, and we're talking about visual contrast like lights and darks, sometimes things get muddy, and more importantly, it becomes distracting. So I would say that the two on the side, so the left and the right, are very good about having a good contrast. And the center one, although I love the image, and these are all images I created, so I'm only hating on myself, it's a beautiful image, but it has some contrast issues. And I'll get to why in a second. But just as an example, on the left, we have these dark figures, and then we have white figures. And so it's very, very clear what represents the 7 and what represents the 3 that add up to 10. So let's talk a little bit more about that middle image. Next. So again, I love this image. I really enjoyed creating it, but it has some problems. And if you look on the right, I've actually gone to a color blindness simulator, and these are just 4 of the examples. And if you look at the one that's at the bottom right, you'll notice that the face of one of the characters is really blending into the background. So in this case, maybe it's not affecting readability very much, but it could be really distracting to somebody who's trying to understand what's going on. And these are things that seem like they're not as big a deal, but when you're trying to create something and make sure everyone can view it and everyone can understand it, this is just one example of a way that something unintentional can drive something becoming confusing. Next. And let's talk a little bit more about the actual content of a visual that you have. So I tend to think of this as 2 separate things. One goes back to those faces, right? And how do we create a diverse group of characters that can represent what we need them to represent? And the other extreme, which I don't think is that extreme, is stylized figures. So these would be representing concepts without actually showing the diversity of characters or limiting the amount of information we give about characters. And I want to go into each of these in pros and cons. Next. So let's start with stylized figures. On the right, again, all my art, you can see that stylized figures doesn't always mean a human figure. The bottom is a neuron that just has a face on it. But the top left, you can see that there are these colored figures. And some of the great things about stylized figures is that you can use them more generally, as well as the idea that, especially if you have a few characters and you don't have the ability to have a lot of diversity because there are only a few characters, you can avoid some issues with just the lack of representation that inherently comes with that. Although, as a warning, that's not always a good enough excuse. And also, just like the infographic example that I showed earlier, a lot of times using stylized figures allows you to concentrate on the message instead of the characters. So again, that top left image, we were really focused on talking about clinical trials, the COVID clinical trials. And so the characters, while important for telling the story, weren't as important as the actual message coming across about what the clinical trials were and why they were taking so long and things like that. But of course, there are a lot of issues with this as well. There's no explicit representation, so you're literally not representing anyone. And a lot of times that can really feel like you're avoiding the topic of diversity. And of course, sometimes as far as content is concerned, these things can feel immature or childish or not really well thought out. And so you really have to be very intentional about how you are representing and showing these stylized figures. Next. So let's talk about diverse characters as well, because this has its own pros and cons. I think probably the most obvious pro is that it's easier to relate to. If there are people that you can see that are representative of who you are much more likely to take it in. It also has that explicit representation, which can be really, really useful for tailoring to your audience and making sure that the people that you are trying to talk to see themselves in that. But it does come with these cons of you can't represent every person. It's just not possible. And because you're always going to be in this situation where you really want to have a diverse cast, but you can't represent everyone. You have to be very, very thoughtful and critical about how you're constructing your images. And one of the reasons why you need to be critical is obviously the representation, but another reason is because any image could potentially have something problematic or offensive. And so you really, again, have to be very, very thoughtful when you're constructing things with diverse characters. And next, and the last thing I just want to quickly bring up is the fact that diversity looks a lot of ways. I know that I've seen several questions come up about disability. I think a lot of people think about race. And I know that a lot of people also think about like the sex and the differences in how you represent things for men and women. But there's a lot, and this is not an exhaustive list, but in addition to the ones I've mentioned, cultural and religious practices, mobility and uses of assistive devices, gender expression, relationship and family structure. So the relationship structure might be, siblings or parents and children, or it could be something like polyamorous groupal versus a couple. And then family structure examples might be in one of the images below. You can see a grandmother with her grandchild, and in that case, maybe she's the caretaker for that grandchild. Maybe she's in a multi-generational family where the several generations are living together. And so thinking about more than just, maybe our favorite form of diversity that we're working with can be really, really important. And I encourage you to really think about all the different types of diversity that may come in. Paige, Jerry, did you have any more thoughts on this before we move to questions?
Yeah, just to throw in, and someone, also had a question, even just about like what colors mean to different cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some aspects of this, like I know in lifeology courses, we often try to like by default be like inclusive and show diverse characters, like if everything else is like, if there's not a particular audience in mind. But I think especially when there is, I think, we talk about, especially inclusion oftentimes doesn't mean everyone. If it's for a specific audience, it means that audience or that culture. So, that's where talking to those individuals and getting their feedback is so important. You're not going to know what color means to every culture, or if this particular, these particular images are relevant, or that culture is seeing themselves in it, or that population is seeing themselves in it, unless you talk to them. So I think, going back to your reviewers and interviewing people before you create the content to develop the image style that you're going to use can be critical.
Yeah, and sometimes I feel like it's just, as important, or to make sure that you're addressing those cultural issues or questions or barriers that come up with the content itself, because otherwise I feel like it just feels like tokenism, where you're showing people but you're not actually getting at. I had that experience when I was working, so I mentioned before, I was working on a piece where we added something about post-op depression to some gynecological surgery resources, because women were like, this is crazy, I was actually looking forward to this because I was having so much bleeding or whatever. And then afterwards, I was really devastated. And one woman even said she was suicidal. So we added the information about post-op depression. But then when I tested that with some communities, they said, well, but to us, the word depression means that you're suicidal, or you've kind of like had a very serious break with reality. And so started really kind of figuring out, how do you talk about this in a way that like doesn't tell people, oh, you're gonna go crazy or become suicidal. You might just have some mild depression, without using that terminology. So I feel like there has to be this balance, and make sure that you're getting to those issues. Otherwise, the representation stuff in the images might feel too much like a surface level type of thing.
And that's a good point that I think is worth mentioning again, is that sometimes the same thing you create won't work for multiple audiences. And if your audience is too broad, it could be worth it to create different resources for different people.
It's true. And that can be challenging though, because like
Yes.
where do you draw these lines? So
Yes.
yeah, I'm usually trying to test things for use nationally. So it becomes definitely a real challenge to figure out how do you make sure and you're never going to cover every single base, but the best you can do. And then the great thing is nothing's ever done. You can always go back and improve it as you go. I want to go to some of our questions. And I do want to say one more thing about the earlier question about working with people in the throes of a condition. One thing that I think we often forget about is you can also talk to the partner or family caregiver or care partner. In some cases, that's been my only option when I was doing a program on hospice. Like, it's very difficult to go in and interview people who are on hospice, but talking to family members who went through different experiences with hospice. And increasingly, by the way, we need to think about the family caregiver because, especially with an aging population, they're often the ones who are doing the medication management and all these other things anyway. So they sometimes need to understand it just as much, if not even more than the patient themselves. So that's another really good resource because they're not in like immediate pain or something, but they're watching and observing, and they have a lot to say as well, sometimes different or more than the patients themselves. But I want to get at some of these other questions because we were talking about how, okay, but not everybody knows a Gaius who can do these great visuals. Like, how can we create better visuals, find creatives, and fund this kind of collaboration and work? Because it starts to sound like, well, it's getting expensive. I have to hire a visual artist. I have to recruit patients. I have to compensate the patients in some way. I have to, do all these different things. So how do you guys think about, I guess, addressing these challenges of doing this the right way?
Well, I just want to mention again, I know I said this earlier, that if you've decided to add visuals, having someone I call subject matter expert on visuals early on in the process is always better. And I do think it's worth looking at your budget and seeing, where you're going to put that budget. And I do think that if you are creating visuals, you definitely need to include an artist as soon as you can. And there are plenty of artists out there who have expertise in medical illustration or natural illustration or creating health literacy. So you can find artists who you're not going to have to do a whole lot of tutoring with, if you know what I mean.
Right. And then I think Paige, you and I have talked about like, let's not reinvent the wheel also, like find out what already exists and spend a little bit of time. I've even been called into places that wanted to do like a decision aid for colon cancer screening. And I was like, oh, well, there's actually a couple really good free ones that you can just use. You don't have to reinvent them. But I'm also realizing that we're short on time. So go ahead and I'll just show a couple of our other things here. So one way to not have to reinvent the wheel is the platform I'm working with, which is free. It's a social good platform. Increasingly, we're creating a patient education content clearinghouse or marketplace where people can find a bunch of mostly free resources. And then Paige, you want to spend just a couple seconds mentioning lifology?
Yeah, so to what's been talked about here in terms of collaboration, lifology, we're trying to facilitate this. We're trying to facilitate helping people build more health literate content in the form of, visual stories or, visuals and text together. So we've created a technology platform that makes that easier. So if you go to lifology.io, you can learn more about kind of our flashcard courses. So there's a tech component to that makes it very mobile friendly, and people can swipe through and see these visual stories. But we're really huge proponents of the fact that to create the best lifology courses, we think it has to be a collaboration. So we really like to promote working with storytellers and artists who, they have years of experience learning to engage people, through stories and through, pulling at their heartstrings, really telling stories and creating visuals that do that. And so working with those individuals can just be so valuable, and they can put stuff into forms that you might not ever have thought of. And working with diverse creators is even better, because they can really maybe see things you haven't seen and talk to the audiences you want to reach in a really organic way. So if you go to lifeology.io, we also have a community we're building that has like thousands of artists and storytellers now there from all over the world. And so we're trying to build that diverse community in order to facilitate collaboration, to create more, culturally relevant and inclusive stories around science and health.
And that's actually how this whole webinar even came to be, is you approached me and we collaborated with Gaius to create this lifeology course on creating engaging patient education, and Dakola's even like hosting it, so it's available in both places. So there's so many ways that we can collaborate, I think, and Gaius is obviously one of those amazing artists who you can collaborate with. So Julie, are there any, I'm sure there's more questions and we won't get to all of them, but there's a few minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. There's a short one and a longer one. And the longer one, if we don't have time, I'm thinking we can maybe answer it on the discussion list later on. Quick one is, can you comment about illustrations versus photographs?
Yes, so both are great. And both are, I think, have different purposes. So photographs are great because you can find royalty-free photographs and things like that. They're real. So when you talk about faces, yes, we look for faces in everything, but especially if you have like one audience that's very, very clear, you can find images that will work very well for that. I tend to shy away from using photographs because I'm an artist, so it's easy for me to say that, right? But at the same time, I also understand that it's really useful as far as a really inexpensive or free way to find the visuals that you need. I will say, as far as just to be the artist in me, that having someone create the exact image that you want for your exact science communication piece or health literacy piece is invaluable. I think that the first time people work with artists, when I say that, and I work with a lot of people the first time, they just want to support an artist. And then once we're done with the project, they're like, I had no idea that I was going to be able to do so much and that this was going to change the way that this was created so much. So I do think that being able to create exactly what you need has a huge benefit, especially if you're trying to explain something that's really complex or something that can get by and like really support itself and make it visually engaging for people.
Yeah, and I know too that with my experience both with video and photo and versus animation and illustration, that they just do better with different things. Like when we were trying to explain how an inguinal sac forms, doing a working, iterating with a medical animator was so important, and we could explain something in 30 seconds that most med students still don't understand. Versus like if we're trying to show something that was not anatomy, but was step by step, it was easier sometimes just to video it, or showing people's candid response to using something for the first time. I saw one where somebody used a new piece of diabetic footwear, and seeing their response to it kind of gave like a see it to be it. Like I was excited for other people to try and wear it when I saw real people interacting with it. So I feel like there's just different times when different things are gonna tell the story in the way that you want to tell it.
Thank you guys so much. We just have a few closeout things. I'm sorry, Deborah, I think this is your question about, but we'll get the first question, which we didn't get to. I promise we will send you guys answers, and we'll also address it on the discussion list today, maybe. So we'll get to that. Sorry, we didn't get to. Paige is typing an answer now. But I just want to say quickly that the Health Literacy Solutions Center will have all of this information pretty soon, as soon as we can get it up there. So you can go there to find all of this stuff, as well as a lot of other resources. I just want to extend a huge thank you to Jerry and Paige and Gaius for joining us today. This was really interesting, a topic that needs to be talked about more. And so thank you guys for starting this conversation. And thanks everyone who attended for being here today. Thanks so much.